Chapter 781, Taming the Fifth Year, True Challenge 5. It was condensed elemental fire, not external fire that could be extinguished. Fire imbued directly into the blades themselves, converting them into elemental weapons that carried a persistent effect. The vampire descended again with confidence, trying to force a close-quarters exchange again while still trusting in its regeneration to offset any damage received. The mantis countered the approach with perfect timing. Blade arms cut through a defensive posture that covered the head, this time carrying fire with them into the wound. They impacted the vampire's shoulder, opening a deep wound that should have closed immediately like the others. But the elemental fire entered the wound itself, burning from within where blood control couldn't simply expel it. The vampire shrieked, not an attack scream, but the sound of real pain that made obvious the genuine damage. It pulled away, beating wings desperately to create distance from a new threat it couldn't regenerate through. The wound kept trying to close through automatic blood control activation, but the fire interfered with the process, cauterized tissue that attempted regenerating, created continuous damage that the vampire had to heal actively instead of closing passively through natural ability. The wound took 15 seconds to close completely, 3 times slower than previous injuries, and the vampire had spent significantly more mana accomplishing the healing against the persistent fire damage. Lou observed his beast with surprise that broke his calm expression. The regeneration is weak to fire element, but he didn't have time for adjusting strategy based on new information. The mantis was already attacking again before the vampire could recover position, this time from a different angle that exploited the momentary disorientation. Faster approach, using the same wind element but with small explosions of fire like Lin's technique for extra propulsion that the vampire couldn't cancel at all despite its own air control. Blade arms connected again without mercy, opposite shoulders symmetrically, fire imbuing burning into the fresh wound. More pain, more forced regeneration, more mana spent on healing instead of attacking. The vampire tried counterattacking the next attack at point-blank range, where sonic attack would be unavoidable. It screamed with full power, but the mantis had already retreated and protected its single ear, dodging just outside effective range before sound could damage it. Hit and run, exactly the tactic it had been using throughout the entire fight, except now armed with weapons that actually worked against regeneration. The pattern repeated, the mantis darting in, landing fire-imbued strikes, retreating before retaliation could connect. Each hit forced the vampire to spend mana healing. Each healing took longer than the last, as fire damage accumulated faster than it could be completely purged. The vampire's movements were slowing as mana reserves were focused into regeneration. And in the stands, observers leaned forward as they realized what was happening. The bronze-rank mantis was actually winning against the gold-rank vampire through systematic exploitation of its weakness. Fire imbuing that turned regeneration advantage into liability, draining resources faster than they could be recovered. But before surrendering to inevitable defeat, Lou changed his approach completely. If he couldn't catch the mantis through normal pursuit, if his sonic attacks kept missing the impossibly fast target, he needed betting on something more costly but with greater potential reward. He made his bat descend low, almost touching the arena floor in a controlled fall. The mantis followed, maintaining pressure like a predator sensing a wounded prey. And then the vampire launched his attack abruptly, a screaming sonic attack, not toward where the mantis was positioned, but toward the ground so the sound would bounce and hit both of them with a reflected shockwave. The mantis moved backward at the last moment to reduce the impact that expanded with the bounce effect. But the reduced scream and flying rock struck it partially despite the impromptu evasive maneuvers. Not a direct impact that would have eliminated it instantly, but sufficient to damage and unbalance it in the air, where it was already somewhat clumsy and had to move in relatively straight lines. Enough to affect its wings' control and give the vampire opportunity to counterattack. The mantis couldn't regenerate like its opponent. It was now or never for Lou's vampire. The wounded and lacerated vampire ignored the pain and closed the distance explosively with everything it had left. 15 meters became 10 in a heartbeat. 5, 3 meters, 2, 1. Maximum absorption range achieved. The blood, full of energy from the mantis, began leaving its body through the vampiric draining skill. But it was slow, needed better contact for a more effective transfer. It opened its mouth wide, fangs gleaming with hunger. If it could reach biting range, it could drain much faster through direct contact. The vampire had finally accomplished what it had been seeking throughout the prolonged fight. It caught the mantis in grappling range, not with a complete bite that would end things instantly, not with a decent grip that prevented escape. Sufficient prolonged contact to activate its most potent ability of blood absorption that drained life force. The mantis weakened visibly under the effect, its movements losing some of their incredible speed, the glow of its blade arms dimming fast as energy was siphoned away. Lou smiled with satisfaction at finally turning the tide. There, Rin realized with his huge perception speed that if things continued this way, for a full second his beast wouldn't make it in time, so he charged a mimic with a different element and spoke a single word through their bond. Wood. The mantis's blade arms changed immediately. The fire element disappeared. Green energy replaced it. Wood element. Life and growth perverted into a weapon through elemental manipulation. The blades impacted the vampire's chest just as it was about to complete its bite for maximum drain. The vampire felt the pain of the strike. However, it didn't surrender the advantage it had gained, managing to bite the small mantis with some of his fangs penetrating the chitin. But the wood element had already entered the wound before the energy could be stolen fully, and it began growing with unnatural speed. Not just plant sprouting, but elemental energy that interfered with the vampire's vital processes, entangling itself in its blood, interrupting regeneration in a manner different from fire's cauterization, absorbing back the energy from the vampire, where fire cauterized and burned, destroying tissue that attempted healing through sheer destructive force. Wood element parasitized, grew using the vampire's own vital energy against itself, forcing it to purge the foreign energy before being able to heal properly from the wounds. And that energy returned to the mantis in a reverse flow. The energy of both beasts now flowed in a continuous circle passing from mantis to vampire through bite. But while the vampire didn't release its grip, the mantis kept generating cuts from its chest position using blade arms. At first they were even in the exchange, energy draining both ways. But the cuts increased in frequency and the vegetal absorption grew stronger. And soon the vampire looked visibly more exhausted, also thanks to previous expenditures that had already depleted reserves significantly. But it only needed to bury its teeth slightly deeper, harder, if it could break through the mantis's thorax completely. The audience was completely silent now in unprecedented attention, observing with an absolute focus that made breathing seem too loud, because both sides had a path toward victory visible to those who understood the mechanics. And nobody knew who would reach their win condition first. Lou looked at Ren from across the arena with an expression mixing determination and growing concern. Ren smiled and returned the gaze with calm that suggested confidence rather than worry. Lou realized something at that moment. Ren still hadn't used everything he possessed in reserve. Chapter 782, Taming the Fifth Year, True Challenge 6. Ren lamented internally with a thought that didn't reach his expression. If Lou knew how to use the shadow abilities of the vampire already, this would be much more complex and engaging. But he wasn't using them. Still too new to his gold rank beast. Still learning the complete arsenal his beast offered at this level. Ren had options remaining. Ice, lightning, light, shadows, rare combos and elements he'd maintained in reserve throughout the start of the tournament. Ice and lightning would draw more attention if revealed now. Light especially would be extremely visible to everyone watching. But shadows. The mantis was already invisible, right? Few would notice if it used shadows as well at this point. They would pass unnoticed in the chaos of battle. Ren leaned slightly forward, voice dropping to murmur that only Lu might hear with his special sound abilities if he was paying attention. "Sorry, Lu," he said softly with genuine regret. "You could have won with a more lucky or direct bite. My Mantis's resistance is very low for its attack power. If I didn't use this soon, you probably would have finished breaking through it despite the bigger absorption." It was a truth without false modesty. Ifrin decided to hide all the rarer elements completely. Without this final ace, the Mantis would have likely lost this exchange. The rank difference was real despite appearances. The vampire's strength was too disparate to overcome through normal means. But Ren had options that changed those equations. And, at least one he was going to use now, Ren sent a mental signal through their bond with a specific instruction. The Mantis responded instantaneously without questioning the command. Its blade arms changed again. The green of the wood element disappeared. Fire came back and replaced it with intensity that made the observers flinch. Everyone thought it was a suicidal attack when they saw the concentrated fire. Intense flames that would consume both combatants at this range. And then the Mantis did something that made observers believe they'd been correct in their assessment. It channeled that fire toward the vampire's body, the same body that surrounded it in a grappling position, toward all the wood mana it had injected into the vampire during the battle. The small charges of elemental energy that had accumulated and had been absorbing energy and hindering regeneration, that had been growing slowly, parasitizing vitality throughout the exchange, and ignited it, all at once in a big detonation. Wood mana was flammable by nature, life and growth energy that fed flames like oil feeding fire through natural affinity. And when it ignited inside the vampire's body in dozens of small points simultaneously, the vampire shrieked with a sound that pierced the arena's silence. Not an attack scream, but a scream of pure agony that made obvious there was damage beyond what regeneration could handle. It burned from within, fire propagating through its system, consuming the wood mana, using that energy to burn more intensely in a self-sustaining reaction. It tried regenerating desperately, activated blood control with everything it had remaining. But its mana was severely low. It had spent too much during the prolonged battle, and the fire was too intense, amplified by the wood mana, serving as a perfect combustible fuel source. The regeneration failed to counter the internal burning. The spectators could only see an enormous fireball consuming both combatants, an apparent draw that would eliminate both beasts. But they hadn't seen what happened in the moment before the flames obscured the visibility. The vampire had tried gripping the Mantis more firmly in the death embrace. If it was being eliminated, at least it wouldn't go alone. But its fangs had nothing to grip in the next instant as the Mantis converted to shadows. This wasn't its invisibility camouflage. This was fundamentally different. For a moment, the Mantis wasn't a physical creature, but pure darkness. A shadow that slipped from the vampire's grasp as if it didn't exist on the same plane. Shadow jump. The Mantis materialized near the ground where the dancing shadows from the fireball projected across the arena floor. Several meters below, outside the reach of the falling vampire that was consumed by the huge flames. Invisible to most observers, but completely physical again. The vampire fell, still burning from the inside, still trying desperately to regenerate as its mana reserves hit zero. It hit the ground with an impact that created a small crater, and then its form dispersed into mana particles that dissolved into ambient energy. The fireball dissipated as the vampire ceased to exist. Silence held for 3 seconds as observers processed what they'd witnessed. First victory, Run Patender. The announcement broke the spell. Conversation exploded across the stands as people discussed what they'd seen and what it meant. Lou stared at the space where his vampire had been, understanding the defeat with an expression that mixed a bit of pain, disappointment, and yet also acceptance. He'd known it was a small possibility when talking about Ren, but had hoped his vampire's advantages would be sufficient. Yet Ren had found a way like always. And that shadow jump at the end, Lou looked at Ren and sighed. He knew the Mantis could use not only Shadow Element. Rin had been holding back even more than Lu had expected. The question wasn't whether Rin could defeat his next gold rank beast. It was whether anyone in the first-year tournament could push him hard enough to see his actual limits. And Lu suspected the answer was no. Not with what he'd just witnessed. But the mantis didn't look very victorious in the aftermath of its triumph. It was significantly injured from the exchange. The vampire's bite and absorption had inflicted real damage despite the eventual victory. Cracks visible in its exoskeleton. Movements slower than normal fluid ones. Everyone observed, convinced that in the end it had indeed been too much facing a bronze beast against a gold one in direct confrontation. But as they watched with growing confusion, those cracks began closing. Water element manifesting around the wounds. Not just externally as coating, but internally as well, seeping into damaged tissue. Accelerated healing using water mana in ways that almost mimicked the vampire regeneration abilities. In 30 seconds, the mantis looked almost completely recovered to fighting condition. Only faint traces of damage remaining that would fade with time. It was indeed unfair. Chapter 783, Taming the Fifth Year, Immovable. In the stands, the silence was absolute as observers processed what they were witnessing. Then someone murmured what everyone was thinking with a volume that carried far despite attempting discretion. Forget the Wolverines and their elemental flexibility. That's a true monster of elemental versatility. Another voice added with admiration and maybe a bit of desperation at the implications. Its very existence feels like cheating, because that was exactly what they had witnessed over the course of the battle. A beast that could use all natural elements with mastery that exceeded specialized creatures. That could imbue enormous intensity of elemental power into its blade arms for devastating strikes that hit way above its rank. That could heal itself with water after battle without requiring external support, without even mentioning any of its basic abilities that were extremely useful in their own right. It wasn't a question of raw power output that could be measured and compared. It was complete versatility that defied normal limitations. Responses for every situation. Solutions for every problem. How did you compete against that kind of comprehensive capability? How did you plan a strategy when your opponent had effective answers for everything you attempted? You couldn't. Not without overwhelming force or abilities so specialized they couldn't be countered even with a complete elemental arsenal. The mantis represented a new ceiling that most students couldn't hope to reach regardless of their own beast potential. And Rin still had 2 more beasts he hadn't even deployed in the tournament. Would he even? Victor POV. The agony was unbearable. It transcended simple, physical damage, entering even into his mana system. Victor had blocked the first light-darkness beam with his arms raised defensively. Had resisted the impact with his basically platinum-level power through that long new method. But it hadn't been sufficient against an attack of that magnitude. The attack had launched him backward dozens of meters across the stone floor before the momentum finally stopped. His arms burned from the energy contact. Golden scales cracked like fractured glass. Blood dripping from dozens of small wounds that covered his forearms. The damage was done despite a somewhat successful defense. But Victor Dravenholm wasn't the son of the kingdom's strongest tamer by accident of birth alone. He didn't surrender easily to setbacks or pain. He stood despite agony screaming through nerve endings. Ignoring the pain with discipline born from years of combat training. Ignoring the dizziness from blood loss and shock. Ignoring the wounds that would have incapacitated lesser tamers. He made his choice with clarity despite everything. Complete fusion. He would fight with everything he possessed. Until now, he'd been fused only with the Qilin as his primary beast. His most powerful companion that had been with him longest. But he had a second beast that he'd bonded with too. The Golden Eagle. Gold 2 rank, 1 level below the Qilin, but powerful in its own right. Majestic creature with feathers that gleamed like precious metal, that dominated the skies with grace and power that made it an apex predator. And thanks to Ren's discovery, thanks to the method Run had uncovered and shared with the kingdom's best warriors through generous contribution. Victor could fuse with both beasts simultaneously in a technique that shouldn't be possible under normal cultivation understanding. It was an ability he still hadn't completely mastered despite months of practice. That required exquisite control and massive mana reserves that would exhaust any tamer. But Victor had practiced it extensively, had refined the technique during countless training sessions. And now, in this desperate moment, now he needed it to survive what was coming. Fusion, he ordered, his voice resonating with power that made the air itself vibrate with released energy. The golden eagle manifested in an explosion of brilliant light that made observers shield their eyes. And then it fused with Victor, combining with the Qilin already present in a transformation that pushed the limits of what fusion could achieve. The transformation was instantaneous and majestic in ways that defied simple description. The Qilin's horns grew larger and more regal in appearance, more imposing, branching in patterns that resembled a big golden tree reaching toward the sky. The golden scales became covered with feathers in certain strategic areas, creating hybrid armor that combined the Qilin's resistance with the eagle's mobility. Wings manifested on his arms and back in two pairs that spread wide, 8 meters from tip to tip when fully extended. Not decorative additions, but functional limbs that could actually provide flight. Victor's power tripled from a synergistic fusion, perhaps more than that given how the abilities enhanced each other. This was what complete fusion with two mature gold-rank beasts meant in practical combat terms. This was the limit of what a tamer could achieve before breaking through to platinum rank. It was a late deployment. The first attack had already inflicted damage. Victor was already injured and bleeding, but still in time to defend against what was still coming. Because from the passage in front of him, another beam of light and darkness was forming with ominous energy buildup. Second attack, a bit more powerful than the first based on the concentration visible. Energy accumulation that made the air crackle with static electricity. It launched toward Victor like a spear thrown by an enraged god seeking to punish his mortal presumption. This time Victor didn't raise his arms in that defensive posture that had failed before. This time he lowered his head with deliberate positioning and received the attack with his horns in a technique his Qilin liked to use, but he'd never attempted in real combat. The majestic horns of the fused Qilin enhanced by Eagle's power, branched and reinforced, gleaming with golden energy that rivaled the attacking beam's light and intensity. The impact resonated like thunder that even shook a bit the supposedly immovable ancient ruins' foundations. Light and darkness collided against pure gold in an explosion of conflicting energies, and Victor held firm against that overwhelming force. He didn't retreat despite pressure that would have crushed normal defenses. Wasn't launched backward like before. Didn't yield even a single centimeter of ground. His feet planted in the ancient stone floor like roots of power. His muscles tense to maximum exertion. His complete power manifesting to resist the pushing force of the opponent hiding in the shadows. Chapter 784. Taming the Fifth Year. Immovable too. The beam pushed against his horns, trying to penetrate through sheer persistence, trying to overwhelm through its sustained pressure. Victor's horns held against the assault, dispersing the energy to all sides and channeling the excess into the ground. If it was any normal place, the power would have created a network of cracks in stone from the released power. It was a battle of pure force that transcended technique. Will against will in an impromptu contest. Power against power with no room for tricks. And Victor Dravenholm would not surrender to a coward attacking from safety. He was a powerful winged Qilin through complete fusion. A yellow dragon in truth rather than just title. Son of Dragarian who had reached heights that almost nobody in the kingdom could match. He wouldn't yield easily before pushing back the force of the enemy, one too cowardly to face him directly. The beam began weakening as its energy depleted against the absolute resistance. The energy dispersing into ambient mana. The attack losing cohesion against Victor's unwavering defense. And finally, after what felt like an eternity of sustained pressure, it dissipated completely into harmless light. Victor raised his head slowly, his horns still gleaming with residual power, his eyes burning with contained fury that promised retribution. He looked toward the passage where the attack had originated from a hidden position at the top, and smiled with an expression that contained no warmth or humor. It was a promise rather than a greeting. Whoever you are, I'm going to find you. I'm going to get to you, and you're going to pay for this ambush. His energy wings spread wide in a display of power that made the chamber seem small, and Victor began moving forward with measured steps that echoed with authority, toward the source of the attacks that had tried killing him, toward whoever had committed the monumental error of attacking the son of a true dragon who'd inherited both power and will. The battle had only just begun in earnest, and this time going forward, Victor wouldn't be pushed backward by any force. He was done defending. Now he would attack, and whoever waited in that passage would learn why attacking Victor Dravenholm was a fatal mistake. His complete fusion granted him speed and power that few in the kingdom could match below platinum rank, and he intended to use every bit of it. The hunt was on, and the prey hiding in the shadows was about to discover what happened when you failed to kill a dragon's son with your opening strike. Victor's wings beat once, propelling him forward faster than running could achieve, toward the top in a confrontation that would determine whether he escaped this trap alive. But he received the next beam, this one with stubborn fury and renewed confidence born from desperation, because he had no other viable option in this trap situation. Retreating meant exposing his soldiers behind him to the attacks. The 11 warriors who had accompanied him into the descent and were now climbing the stairs behind him while carrying the wounded soldier who'd warned him. Fortunately, they were still several chambers below his current position and the wounded one even further down. If Victor yielded ground, the beams might become a problem for his soldiers as well, reaching them through the straight passage, killing them before they could escape to safety. And advancing was the only possible option for him. Forward through the straight passage without cover, toward the stairs that led to the exit and freedom, toward where his cowardly enemy still hid while launching attacks from safety. He couldn't move to the sides, the passage was too narrow and the walls immutable. Forward or backward were the only viable directions. So only forward in the end, because Victor Dravenholm had learned to retreat and throw his ego aside during the last war, when being a leader demanded flexibility. But he wouldn't retreat when it was no longer about his ego, but about protecting those under his command. Yet the complete fusion was extracting its price with each passing moment. He was already injured from the first attack. The wounds on his arms, the cracks in his scales, and the blood that still dripped because he hadn't had time to heal completely before the second beam. And now the effort of maintaining fusion with 2 gold-rank beasts simultaneously, ranks 2 and 3, while resisting attacks that would have killed most tamers. Maybe he was getting accustomed to the enormous power output of both the beam and his own capabilities. He resisted the third beam without being pushed backward, then received another with the same horns that gleamed with dispersing energy. Each impact resonated through his fused body like a hammer striking a bell. Each explosion of light and darkness pushed against his horns with force that would have shattered rocks reinforced with the mana of the best earth element tamers. But Victor didn't just endure the assault. He pushed forward. After the third beam dissipated, he'd gained half a meter of ground, walking forward while energy dispersed around his horns, forcing the attacker to concentrate more power or eventually be forced to retreat themselves. After the fourth beam, he advanced another full meter. He was truly making progress toward his goal, slowly in increments that felt insufficient, painfully with each step costing him reserves, but advancing nonetheless toward confrontation. Was he actually getting accustomed to the pattern? However, his energy was depleting rapidly despite adaptation. Each beam he blocked drained more mana from finite reserves. Each step forward required more concentration to maintain the fusion stability. Each second of complete fusion consumed resources that wouldn't replenish until he could rest appropriately. The fifth beam struck him with a force that made his knees tremble under the impact. Victor kept them firm through sheer willpower, refused to fall despite pressure, refused to show weakness to the enemy watching. But internally his thoughts were darker. I can't sustain this much longer. The fusion was beginning to unravel at the edges where control was weakest. The energy wings flickering slightly as power wavered. The golden feathers losing some of their brilliant shine. And then came the sixth beam. And this one was fundamentally different from what preceded it. Chapter 785, Taming the Fifth Year, Immovable 3. Strange Energy. Victor saw it forming in the passage ahead with growing dread. Light and darkness as before, intertwining together, concentrating into a devastating attack. But there was something more this time. A purple energy mixing with the other two elements in ways that shouldn't be possible, tinting the beam with color that shouldn't exist in Mana's nature. That felt wrong on a fundamental level that made his instincts scream warnings. The beam launched toward him with malevolent intent. Victor positioned his horns to the front again to receive it in a defensive posture that had worked before. The impact was stronger than any previous attack by a significant margin. The force knocked him down despite his huge, enhanced strength. His legs gave out under the impossible weight. His knees struck the stone floor with a sound that echoed through the passage like thunder. But his horns remained elevated despite the half-fall, still receiving the attack, still dispersing the energy away from vital areas. And Victor maintained his position without yielding. He didn't retreat backward, wasn't pushed away from the ground he'd gained. Felt at his knees, yes, but didn't lose even a single centimeter of hard-won territory. The new beam pressed against his defenses with sustained pressure. The purple energy burning differently than light and darkness had. More insidious in how it worked. More penetrating through the standard defenses. And Victor recognized the sensation with growing horror. Corruption, not exactly matching what he knew. It was similar, but not identical to standard corruption. Like the energy the mutants used, what he'd faced so many times recently in the New Frontiers during expansion missions. That corruption that was modified somehow, adapted into something new that defied his understanding. And to his growing alarm, Victor realized that the purification the mushroom beast of Run had activated in him accidentally that day wasn't very effective against this modified form of corruption. The purification worked against standard corruption patterns, could cleanse it, neutralize it almost completely through natural resistance. But this variant, this was different in some way. The purple energy combined more easily with the common elements, filtered through the attack flow, and also through his defenses despite his passive purification. Not rapidly in ways he couldn't track, not overwhelmingly to disable him immediately, but constantly, persistently accumulating despite resistance. It seemed to be finding cracks in his defenses, exploiting weaknesses in his system, infecting him slowly with each moment of contact. The beam finally dissipated after what felt like an eternity of sustained assault. Victor remained on his knees for 3 seconds, breathing heavily with exertion, his fused body trembling from the effort of resisting, then forced himself to stand again despite the exhaustion, and saw something that made his blood run cold with realization. His arms, where the first beam had struck him, where the burns had been most severe. There were small crystalline formations, so tiny they were almost unnoticeable at first glance, but definitely present, growing on his skin, in his flesh, on his golden scales. Victor raised a trembling hand to touch his forehead with growing dread. His fingers brushed against his horns where beams had impacted, and felt a texture that was wrong. Rough where it should be smooth, irregular instead of the perfect surface he knew. Small crystal fragments adhered to them. He ran his hand more completely across his horns, feeling with increasing horror the small networks of crystal forming even until his forehead. Patterns that extended from where the beams had impacted repeatedly. Not much yet. barely perceptible to casual examination, but definitely there, growing with each passing second. It's crystallizing me. The thought struck with a weight of absolute certainty that couldn't be denied. This wasn't just damage from energy attacks. It wasn't just mutated corruption that could be cleansed. It was similar to the process that had converted his father and the corrupted Yino people into statues of dense crystal in that chamber. He then also thought about the statues he had just seen as he was thinking of their similars. And then the pieces clicked together in his mind with a weird clarity. The statues below in the terminal chamber. The woman from Yino specifically with her distinctive features. The two crystallized hearts that should have been in the initial door's indentations, that were now missing from their pedestals or their initial owners, that maybe someone still possessed somewhere. What if those artifacts had belonged to the Yino kingdom and had helped with their rapid development of that crystal of corruption and its fast-growing power before Dragarian had stopped their expansion? What if before Dragarian could completely halt the corruption and that crystal, the corruption from the artifact had already begun or even succeeded in creating something different? What if whoever possessed those artifacts now was using them to attempt finishing Victor in this ambush? The purple energy, the crystallization process, the way his natural purification wasn't working appropriately against it. Everything pointed to the same horrible conclusion that he couldn't escape. He was being converted into a statue like those below, slowly but inexorably unless he found a way to stop the process or escape before completed. And he was trapped in a narrow passage with an enemy who could keep launching these corrupted beams who knows how many times while he crystallized from repeated exposure. The situation had gone from dangerous to potentially fatal. Victor looked up the passage toward where the attacks originated. He still had only one choice: advance and fight his way through while risking complete crystallization before reaching the enemy. It wasn't really a choice at all. Victor Dravenholm was many things, but he wasn't a coward who abandoned those under his command. He would advance, and either he would reach his enemy and end this, or he would become a statue standing guard over his soldiers' escape route. But he wouldn't retreat, not while men who trusted him still needed protection. His wings spread despite their flickering energy. And Victor began walking forward again with steps that grew heavier as crystallization spread, toward an enemy who'd made a fatal error. They'd given him a goal to reach. And Victor Dravenholm didn't stop once he had a goal, even if he had to do it as a living statue. Chapter 786, Taming the Fifth Year, Immovable 4. Lu had one beast remaining in his tournament roster. The hyena. Rin observed it materializing on the field with a thoughtful expression, evaluating its present capabilities before the battle even began through fast but careful analysis. It was an enormous creature that commanded attention, with a throat grotesquely expanded through specialization, muscle layered upon muscle designed specifically for generating sounds at impossible volumes. And the sounds it could produce. Rin had heard the hyena many times during previous training sessions when helping Lu develop its techniques. The screams were otherworldly in their intensity. Frequencies that shouldn't exist in nature. Waves that vibrated through bones and made internal organs tremble with resonance. The vampire sound attacks had been impressive in their own right, concentrated and precise for pinpoint targeting. But the hyena was fundamentally different in its approach. Its sonic strikes were broader in coverage, more sustained and complex in their patterns, could maintain prolonged screams that filled complete spaces with destructive vibration that damaged everything within range. But if we're talking about sound attacks, Rin thought with a slight ironic smile, fortunately fused beasts don't participate here, because he knew exactly what Lu could create if he fused the vampire with the hyena in the combination technique. He'd seen the result during training, had helped Lu understand the possibilities when teaching him the advanced fusion methods. The combination was terrible in its effectiveness, but it made sense they weren't using fusion here, that the exam rules prohibited such techniques, because fusing knocked the Tamer unconscious for extended periods afterward. It wasn't the few hours necessary to recover connections lost in normal mana projection. Fusion consumed gigantic quantities of energy that were lost in the transformation process, required a full day or more of rest to recover appropriately for another attempt. If they permitted these fusions in the exams, the first student who used one would become useless for following rounds. The second day would reveal the last one to be a Pyrrhic victory at best. So a closer look at everyone's new fusions and whether I can defeat them in a serious battle will have to wait for later, Run concluded with mild disappointment. For now, the unfused hyena was a big enough problem to solve, because beyond its sonic capability that rivaled specialized beasts, it had good armor. Rin studied it more closely with an analytical eye. Bone plates covering the hyena's body in overlapping protection. Not any normal bone that could be shattered. Bone that appeared inherited from dragon lineage, white as ivory, with texture suggesting impossible density. The bones were so hard it was difficult to believe they were organic material. Ren had witnessed the hyena receiving strikes from low gold-rank beasts that barely left marks on the armor when it was still silver rank. And now that the hyena had reached gold rank through cultivation, that defense had scaled proportionally with its rank increase. Lu's vampire had relied on regeneration as its defensive strategy, sacrificed physical resistance in exchange for capacity to heal rapidly from injuries. Its defense wasn't particularly impressive for its rank tier, but the hyena was exactly the opposite in design philosophy. This beast had true gold-rank defense that matched its offensive capabilities. In fact, even above average for the rank tier. The bone armor was more resistant than what most gold-rank beasts could form naturally through normal evolution. Rin frowned slightly while making mental calculations about approach. Can a mantis deal sufficient damage to overcome that armor? Against the vampire, it had worked perfectly. The elemental imbuing attacks had penetrated because the vampire's defense was low and regeneration could be overwhelmed with different approaches. But against bone armor with resistance similar to semi-dragon scales, Rin was confident that if he pushed the mantis to imbue lightning into its blade arms, it would be sufficient to breach those defenses. The combination of fire and wind in focused electrical form had superior penetrating power, or simply evading the hardest protected parts and cutting at unprotected zones at that speed wouldn't be difficult with proper maneuvering. But the question remained, do I want to reveal that my Bronze 2 beast can combine elements for the general public? It was an important consideration that went beyond simple tactical advantage. Until now, the mantis had demonstrated capability to use all natural elements individually with mastery. Fire, water, earth, wind, wood, and shadows, though few had noticed that last revealed during the escape. That alone was already impressive enough. Already broke expectations about what beast of its rank should be able to accomplish. But combining elements to the point of transforming them into new elements was a completely different level of mastery and control that only the most elite tamers achieved. Lightning was a fusion of fire and wind working in harmony. Required control over both elements simultaneously, balancing them in perfect equilibrium to create an emergent third element. Sulfurous ice was a fusion of water and wind through the same principle. Same level of difficulty that took decades to master. Ifrin showed that the mantis could accomplish that level of element fusion. He would be revealing a depth of capability that even expert tamers would find difficult to believe was possible at bronze rank. Would provoke more questions and speculation about his true strength that would serve as warning to his enemies, making them prepare too thoroughly in case they decided to attack him because of those revealed capabilities and would close off his options. Additionally, it was attention he perhaps didn't want yet at this stage. I've had enough fun with the mantis already, Ren decided after a moment of consideration and weighing options. I tested for myself some pros and cons of versatility in a less resistant body. He'd learned what he needed from this battle against a gold rank opponent. The mantis was incredibly flexible in combat applications, had answers for almost any situation through elemental mastery, could adapt its strategy instantaneously to counter opponents. But it also had a fundamental weakness that couldn't be ignored: low resistance to direct damage. When a vampire had trapped it in absorption range, when it had received direct damage from a bite, it had deteriorated very rapidly despite superior power. Only luck and quick thinking with Shadow Jump had saved it from losing the battle by a narrow margin. Extreme versatility wasn't perfect protection against relative fragility when caught. Useful information to know. Important to understand for future strategic planning. But not something he needed continuing to test against the bone-armored hyena. It's time to try something more appropriate for the challenge, Rin thought, a small smile touching his lips with anticipation. And give my most well-known beast some spotlight for once. The Hydra hadn't had much time showing off its two heads since the evolution. This seemed like a perfect opportunity to demonstrate what it could accomplish. A bit late, sorry. Body still recovering. Chapter 787, Taming the Fifth Year, Immovable 5. Rin remembered the surprise on the faces of teachers and students alike when the second head had first appeared. Because everyone knew that hydras could only accumulate heads in their wild form, when they reached absurdly deep depths where pressure, heat, and mana density allowed such development. The few whose eggs had been found and which had bonded to human tamers, domesticated beasts, were supposedly limited to a single head permanently through some fundamental restriction. Except they weren't actually restricted at all. They only needed someone to find the appropriate cultivation method to overcome that perceived limitation that everyone had accepted as the absolute truth. And Ren had cultivated his Hydra perfectly for breaking that barrier. Even more than perfectly in execution, refining its complete elemental control that shouldn't exist in its lineage through the standard evolution, pushing it in many ways far beyond what others believed possible for the species. The second head had been the indisputable result of Ren's knowledge of cultivation, proving that old perceptions were just incorrect assumptions, not natural law. That the limits everyone accepted as absolute truth were simply a lack of understanding about the proper development. As always, Ren had broken the expectations that constrained most others. The two-headed Hydra had been talked about extensively for a good while after its reveal. Conversations in the academy hallways between students. Topic of debate among professors who studied beast cultivation. Examples cited alongside Turo's enormous beetle when discussing unexplored potential in beast development. But after the initial commotion settled, the Hydra hadn't had many opportunities to truly shine and demonstrate its capabilities. Most discussion had remained speculation rather than observation. In the mid-semester exam, everyone had wanted to see it in action with great anticipation, but Ren's previous attack group had been so large and so dominant in their coordination. So many powerful beasts manifested simultaneously, created a presence that eclipsed individual contributions or simply didn't allow them space to demonstrate their powers. The Hydra had participated in those battles, yes, had contributed in team fights, had demonstrated some of its power in the group context, but it hadn't needed to use much of its true power or acted in a moment that was truly its own. Hadn't shown what it was capable of when it had Ren's complete attention focused on it alone. And it also hadn't displayed its new multi-elemental capacity like the Mantis had been doing just now. Because the Hydra had also absorbed effect from the Jade Mana exposure, had also developed control over multiple elements through that transformative process. Not at the same level as the Wolverine, which specialized in elemental manipulation, but sufficient given its much higher mana level and development to leave the Mantis considerably behind in raw power. Sufficient to surprise many with what would come now. Sufficient to make clear that Ren's elemental versatility wasn't limited to a single beast in his arsenal. It's time for putting two beasts of the same size to confront each other, Ren decided finally after considering matchup options. The hyena was enormous in stature. The Hydra also matched that scale. It would be a different kind of fight from what spectators had witnessed. Not speed versus power. Not flexibility versus regeneration. Size versus size. Power versus power. And Ren wanted to see how his Hydra handled that type of direct confrontation against an equally massive opponent. But first, satisfying the initial curiosity that his curious mind demanded. First, he wanted one final data acquisition before committing to the main strategy. Master Lin raised her hand with a ceremonial gesture. Begin. The hyena opened its enormous throat in preparation. The sound that emerged made several spectators cover their ears instinctively despite their distance from the arena. It wasn't a normal scream like the ones other beasts produced. It wasn't a roar or growl. It was a maddening, pure vibration that traveled through the air like a visible physical wave, distorting everything it touched through sheer sonic force. Ren had already given an order to the mantis before the sound could reach across the distance. Maximum speed, control at level 2. Test strike. The mantis had used the combination of fire and wind before for its maximum revealed propulsion. Heat expanding the air behind it in controlled explosions. Wind channeling that expansion in specific directions with precision, gaining propulsion that launched it like a projectile toward its target. It wasn't lightning yet through complete elemental fusion. Wasn't the level 3 elemental control of combining the elements fully into electricity that would reveal true mastery. But it was fast regardless. Incredibly fast by any standard measurement. The mantis shot toward the hyena like a blur, almost impossible to track visually even for enhanced observers. The hyena's sound wave reached it at the midway point between starting positions. The impact would have shattered normal beasts completely. The vibration entering its body, making organs vibrate out of synchronization, destroying internal structures through the resonance damage. But the mantis created a small vacuum around itself as a defensive technique. Air being evacuated in a semi-sphere with a half-meter empty space from the mantis exoskeleton. Without air, as medium, sound couldn't travel appropriately through the empty space. It wasn't flawless protection against the attack. The sphere distorted from the enormous velocity of movement, and some vibration still passed through the imperfect vacuum. The mantis suffered sharp pain from the partial exposure, but the defense was sufficient for its purpose. The mantis reached the hyena despite the sonic assault, its blade arms already manifested, gleaming with the concentrated and explosive wind and fire strength for maximum impact, and struck with full force. But not at the inflated throat as it had targeted. The hyena managed to rotate in time and covered it with the bone of its foreleg in a defensive reflex. The blade arms impacted the bone armor on the hyena's side with a force that should have penetrated the harder shells of gold-rank pyroclast shell bears. For a fraction of a second, contact was established between weapons and armor, and then Rin deactivated the mantis voluntarily. The beast dissolved into mana particles, returning to its storage space in Ren's chest, disappearing from the field before any counterattack could land. Chapter 788, Taming the Fifth Year, Immovable, 6. Teacher Lin blinked in confusion at the unexpected development, raised her hand with uncertainty about what would be the proper procedure here. Second victory point for Lu, she announced hesitantly. Lu also looked confused despite the apparent win, staring at the empty space where the mantis had been milliseconds ago, then looking toward Ren as if looking for an explanation. The audience murmured with growing confusion, not understanding what they'd just witnessed. Had Ren just given away the point? Free victory without contest? Almost correct in their assessment, but not completely accurate. Ren had obtained what he needed from that brief exchange. He didn't want to lose his link with the mantis through destruction. Deactivating it voluntarily didn't hurt. It was almost instantaneous and a natural process. And there was no point in letting it be destroyed and suffering that acceptable but still annoying pain of a broken connection. If he'd left the mantis manifested after the strike had made contact, the sound damage it had been avoiding with its vacuum defense would have traveled as direct vibrations through the physical contact. The hyena was the source of the sonic attack. Touching it meant exposing yourself to vibrations in its most concentrated form at the point of origin. The mantis would have received massive damage from that exposure, possibly sufficient to break its body and the link completely if Ren didn't withdraw it in time. And Rin didn't want that outcome. The broken link didn't just hurt. It required time to reestablish, and that would leave him feeling weird and not fully focused on getting more data. Better, canceling the mana entity voluntarily, avoiding greater damage through a timely retreat. Besides that consideration, Rin hadn't wanted to win with that attack anyway. He only wanted to see the extent of its damage against the hyena's defense for data collection. And he'd seen what he needed. On the hyena's side, where the blade arms had impacted with full force, there was a small notch in the bone armor. Minimal damage that would heal quickly, exactly as Rin had suspected based on previous observations. The bone armor was too resistant. The mantis's standard strikes, even amplified with 2 elements, wouldn't be sufficient to penetrate appropriately for lethal damage. Would need to use the lightning element through its complete fusion to be fast enough to avoid the shielding or penetrate it, or a massive quantity of repeated attacks on the same point to wear through. Or better option, different beast entirely. Data obtained. Rin thought with satisfaction at the successful test. Now I know exactly what type of defense I'm facing. Rin didn't give space for questions from confused observers. Didn't offer any explanations for his strange tactical decision that seemed like surrender. Simply raised his hand and manifested his next beast for the real confrontation. The Hydra appeared in an explosion of mana that made the ground tremble beneath its weight. 2 diamond-scaled serpentine heads, with 2 horns each, rose on powerful necks, each one capable of independent action and thought. The body was also covered in scales that gleamed with dense mana that gave it high durability and defensive capability, easily matching the hyena in size and presence. The crowd's murmuring stopped as they processed what they were seeing. This wasn't retreat or surrender. This was getting serious. The Hydra coiled in the arena, both heads tracking the hyena with predatory focus. Lu's confusion transformed into understanding as he realized the real battle was about to start. Lin looked between the 2 beasts, then raised her hand again. Begin. The hyena opened its throat again, preparing the same sonic assault that had worked before. But this time it faced a different opponent. The hyena possessed sound power that exceeded the vampire's capabilities by a significant margin. The vampire could help it direct those sonic attacks through coordination in Lu's body or during fusion, and together they formed a genuine threat that few could withstand. But separated, not so much, at least not for someone like Rin who knew both beasts extensively. Overcoming an intense but unfocused howl that got dispersed in all directions wasn't particularly difficult when you understood its mechanics. The hyena ballooned its massive throat even more in preparation for its signature attack. The eerie and wild sound that emerged made half the spectators cover their ears immediately in an instinctive defensive reaction. The other half did so half a second later when the pain finally registered through their initial shock at the sheer volume. It was a sound attack more powerful than anything the vampire had produced during its entire battle. The hyena's throat was designed specifically for this singular purpose through mana-enhanced evolution. Resonance chambers built into its anatomical structure, muscles connected to viscous and stretchable structures that could sustain continuous vibration without tearing themselves apart. Vocal cords that didn't exist in any other bee species through specialized development. The sound filled the entire field completely. Visible pressure waves distorted the air itself through sheer sonic force, creating ripples you could actually see with the naked eye. The vibrations traveled through the ground beneath everyone's feet, making the stone tremble. The stands shook where the audience sat observing with growing discomfort as the sustained assault continued without pause. Some professors had raised preventive barriers to protect the closest spectators, knowing Lu's beasts very well from previous incidents during training sessions where the hyena's power had caught people unprepared. But even with those protective barriers hastily erected, the observers weren't completely exempt from the suffering caused by such overwhelming sound. Rin squinted his eyes against the pressure and smiled in a manner that showed he was uncomfortable, but was still a challenging look. It was time to act, to silence his friend's powerful but clumsy beast before it could do real damage to the spectators where his parents and friends were too. But then something changed. The scream itself changed in a fundamental way that made Ren's expression shift. It didn't disappear into nothing, didn't weaken in volume or increase in intensity. It focused up with deliberate intent. The spectators felt much less pain suddenly as the pressure shifted away from them. The relief was immediate and noticeable. The sound wave that had been dispersing in all directions like a sphere began concentrating itself through some method, compressing into a tighter cone, directing itself toward a specific point with deliberate targeting that shouldn't be possible for a beast like this. Then, down toward the Hydra, standing motionless in the arena. Ren blinked in genuine surprise, caught off guard for the first time in this battle by the unexpected development. Liu learned how to direct it without me knowing about his progress. Sorry, preparing for last party of the year took some unexpected time, but I'm doing the last ones now. Chapter 789, Taming the Fifth Year, Immovable, 7. Liu had impressed him. It wasn't an easy technique by any measure. The hyena generated omnidirectional sound by its very nature through its anatomical design. Its throat projected sound in an area effect that covered everything equally. It was simultaneously the beast's greatest strength and most crippling weakness. Massive power output, but almost impossible to focus without the assistance of a creature like the bat to guide the waves. Except Liu had somehow found a method earlier than Run had expected, accomplishing it without outside assistance. Perhaps he was using subtle mana control to channel the waves. Perhaps modulating the throat's vibration pattern in a manner that naturally converged on a focal point through acoustic physics. Perhaps simply engaging in tireless practice until mastering a technique that nobody else could teach him properly, being the bearer of the first golden banshee hyena in history. Regardless of which method Liu had discovered through experimentation, the concentrated attack was significantly more dangerous than the general dispersion had been moments before. Reduced range of effect, but massively concentrated power at the focal point. Sufficient force to destroy the internal organs of any creature without appropriate protection against sonic damage. Sufficient vibration to make bones resonate until they fractured from the accumulated stress. Sufficient power to kill outright. Run, standing behind his beast in the designated tamer position, reacted instantaneously to the threat now directed at him. I'll make a double bubble defense, just in case the attack has more power than expected. It was a technique of greater difficulty than what the Mantis had accomplished with its crude single-layer vacuum. But, with the Wolverine fused within his body providing dramatically enhanced elemental control, he had more than sufficient capability for the advanced defensive technique. Wind mana exploded outward from Ren's position in a controlled burst. The energy wasn't distinctly visible to normal eyes without mana sensitivity, but it was clearly perceptible to those observers who possessed the special sensitivity to detect such manipulations. A bubble formed around him with precise control. Then another layer, and another beyond that. 3 concentric layers of sophisticated protection. The first layer, positioned immediately around Ren's body, contained normal air that was only slightly compressed for structural stability. He needed to breathe, after all, so he shouldn't create a complete vacuum around himself. The second layer, exactly 1 centimeter beyond the first, was a perfect vacuum without a single molecule of air remaining. Empty space where sound fundamentally couldn't travel because there was no physical medium available to transmit the vibrations through. The third layer, another precise centimeter beyond the second, was a deliberate repetition of the pattern, air and vacuum layered again. A redundant defensive layer. Additional security measures to prevent catastrophic collapse under sustained, unexpected pressure. It was an incredibly complicated construction to maintain for most tamers, even those at gold rank who specialized in the wind element. The Mantis had already found it difficult creating a simple, single-layer vacuum around itself during its brief test. The technique had been effective but crude in execution. This defensive structure was a masterpiece of elemental engineering in comparison. It used the Wolverine's vastly superior power over Wind Element to manifest a defense that no other beast below Gold Rank 3 should be capable of producing through normal means. The concentrated sound attack struck Ren's bubble defense with the full force of focused sonic energy, and the triple-layered bubble protected Ren completely from any harm. The pressure waves bounced harmlessly against the outer vacuum layer, without air molecules to vibrate, without any physical medium to transmit the sonic waves through. The sound simply stopped at the barrier. Ren felt nothing except slight pressure in his ears from the minor compression of air in his innermost protective barrier. The sensation was mildly annoying, but not harmful in any way. The defense had functioned perfectly as designed through proper application. But then Ren returned his full attention to the one who had been the attack's primary intended target. The Hydra, standing motionless in the arena. Ren hadn't given it any orders yet through their bond, so the beast had been operating on its own judgment. It hadn't tried counterattacking while the hyena was generating its scream. And more surprisingly, it also hadn't defended itself in any visible way. Hadn't created a vacuum bubble like Ren had done. Hadn't raised defensive mana barriers around its body. Hadn't done anything except remain completely motionless in place, both serpentine heads observing the hyena with something that almost resembled mild curiosity rather than concern. The concentrated sound attack was striking the Hydra directly without any interference. The hyena was maintaining an assault extremely close to the theoretical peak of 194 decibels of pure vibration. The technique was carefully avoiding letting the vibration degrade into a simple physical shockwave, but taking it beyond normal sonic limits instead, feeding the sound waves in the air with injections of pure mana, achieving a vibration effect that should be theoretically impossible under natural physics, and that was sufficiently powerful to liquefy internal organs, to fracture bones from resonant stress, to kill beasts of superior rank outright if they didn't possess some type of specialized protection against sonic damage. And the Hydra, standing there without any visible defense, showed absolutely no damage whatsoever from the sustained assault. In the stands above, students exchanged confused glances with each other at the inexplicable sight unfolding below. "What the hell?" someone murmured in complete disbelief at what they were witnessing. The attack hit it directly. You can literally see the pressure waves impacting its scales. Then why isn't it being injured at all? There should be blood, cracked scales, something. The confusion spread through the crowd like wildfire as people struggled to understand what they were observing. Liu also looked genuinely perplexed by the complete lack of effect his strongest attack was having. His expression showed growing concern as seconds passed and stretched until they almost became a full minute of sustained sonic assault. His hyena finally stopped howling after that extended barrage, now panting heavily from the considerable exertion. The concentrated attack technique required far more energy than the normal omnidirectional dispersion, draining stamina rapidly. But the attack had connected cleanly without any question. Hadn't missed the target. The Hydra had been positioned exactly in the center of the focused sound cone for the entire duration. There should be some visible damage to the beast from an attack of that magnitude. There should be some observable reaction to the concentrated assault, pain, discomfort, defensive posturing, something that indicated the attack had registered. But the Hydra simply stood there in the same position it had occupied before. Its scales gleamed brilliantly under the afternoon sunlight without any visible marks or damage. Without the slightest sign of pain or discomfort from the sustained sonic assault it had just endured, as if absolutely nothing had happened to it at all. As if the attack had been gentle breeze rather than devastating sonic weapon. Truly immovable. Chapter 790, Taming the Fifth Year. Immovable 8. The silence that followed the hyena's scream was deafening in its own way. Nobody in the stands understood what they were witnessing before their eyes. A gold-rank sonic attack that should have been utterly devastating to any creature, completely and totally ineffective against what appeared to be a gold-ranked beast standing there like it was made of solid diamond. Master Lin stared at the Hydra with narrowed eyes, her experienced gaze trying to understand what defensive technique could possibly explain this immunity. But even she couldn't detect any active defenses around the creature. Rin smiled slightly with satisfaction at the demonstration's success, pleased with how this was unfolding. The Hydra wasn't just powerful in offensive capability through its two independent heads and their beam attacks. It was an absolute defensive wall that could withstand punishment that would obliterate most other beasts. And now everyone watching would understand precisely why he'd chosen it for this particular matchup against the hyena. The hyena could scream all it wanted with its maximum power. The Hydra wouldn't feel a single thing from the assault. Liu stared across the arena at Run with dawning comprehension in his eyes, understanding that he'd just revealed his best attack, his strongest offensive capability, and it had accomplished absolutely nothing against his opponent. Several spectators began theorizing out loud, trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Perhaps it has some kind of magical resistance we don't understand, or maybe a less visible barrier than the one Rin manifested, something we simply failed to notice. But the few observers who possessed mana-enhanced vision shook their heads upon hearing those types of suppositions. There was no ambient mana circulating around the Hydra's body. No defensive barriers that their enhanced sight could detect. Could be that sound doesn't travel well through those transparent scales for some reason. No, a voice called out from the upper stand with authority that came just from being older. It was an 8th-year student who'd been observing carefully. That doesn't make any sense at all. Glass shatters easily with sounds and vibrations far less intense than what we just witnessed. That last theory gained traction rapidly through the crowd. It had superficial sense, but it appealed to people. Perhaps the Hydra scales that appeared crystalline in nature functioned similarly to glass in their acoustic properties. But there was an obvious and fundamental problem with that particular theory. Finch, who had done the unthinkable thanks to not being as financially constrained anymore due to his new second job courtesy of Ren's generous employment, had requested the day off specifically to watch his favorite magnate in action. The day off? Me, Finch thought. He adjusted his broken glasses with careful fingers while Theodore cleaned some of the crystal fragments that had fallen earlier and still clung to his worn suit. Crystal, like fine wine glasses or my spectacles here, is vulnerable to acoustic resonance. Finch began with the slightly pompous tone he adopted when explaining any concepts. If a sound matches the natural frequency of the crystal material and is sufficiently loud, author's note, roughly 105 decibels based on standard measurements, the glass vibrates with such amplitude that it shatters. The material is too inelastic to absorb the vibrational energy, so it fragments catastrophically. He paused dramatically, studying the Hydra scales more closely with his damaged lenses. But those scales, he continued slowly, building suspense, aren't crystal at all. There. He stopped with theatrical timing, his eyes widening in feigned recognition despite barely being able to see anything through the broken lenses. Diamond, he murmured with perfect emphasis. The word dispersed through the stands like its own shockwave, spreading outward. Of course, the Hydra has diamond scales instead of normal ones. And how is that different from crystal? Aren't they similar? On the field below, Rin smiled slightly at hearing the discussion drift down from the stands. His Hydra scales had the perfect form and distribution for maximum defensive capability. They weren't just hard and filled with concentrated mana for enhancement. They were also layered over elastic sections and other hard sections between the internal layers, overlapping when in resting position, but allowing a wide range of mobility during movement, thus avoiding the common problem where a diamond defense possessed only hardness without toughness to absorb impacts. Not all of the Hydra's scales were pure, continuous diamond. That would be too uncomfortable, too inflexible for a creature that needed to move. But all of its external parts had sufficient crystalline carbon structure to share the key defensive properties. And one of those crucial properties was almost absolute resistance to damage from sonic attacks. In the stands, Finch continued his explanation with his voice, gaining even more theatrical confidence as people paid attention. Diamond may appear somewhat similar to crystal, but it's extremely resistant to noise-based damage. Unlike crystal, which shatters when exposed to high-pitched sounds, diamond is practically deaf to any destructive resonance. He gestured with his hands to emphasize the point. The properties that give diamond its legendary hardness and the atomic carbon bonds are so rigid and compact that its natural resonance, frequency, exists far beyond the range where sound-based attacks can affect it. Authors note, diamond's resonance frequency operates in the trillions of hertz, compared to the roughly 1,000 hertz range of human hearing sensitivity. To actually damage diamond with sound alone would require sonic energy that's physically impossible to generate in our atmosphere. We're talking about decibel levels that only exist at the center of nuclear explosions or cosmic events. Sound also travels through diamond at approximately 12,000 meters per second compared to 340 meters per second in air. But traveling fast doesn't mean causing damage. It simply passes through without affecting the molecular structure. /__/ wanted to say in the story, but Finch can't break the fourth wall with modern knowledge that much. He paused to ensure others in the crowd understood the implications. The golden banshee hyena, even with its powerful attack enhanced by mana infusion, isn't even remotely sufficient to overcome that fundamental material property. Finch's basic explanation, but somehow fully true, rippled through the audience as understanding dawned on more observers. The Hydra hadn't needed to defend itself at all. Not because it possessed some invisible magical barrier they couldn't detect. Not because the attack had somehow failed to connect properly. But simply because its diamond scales were functionally immune to the specific type of damage that the hyena could inflict through sonic attacks. It was a perfect counter matchup. A beast whose primary attack was sound-based confronting a beast whose defenses had the ideal composition, whether through fortunate luck, natural evolution, or Wren's intentional cultivation methods to nullify that attack type completely.